Welcome to English Grammar Session 8. Today we're still staying within the world of advanced syntax as we take a closer look at a related syntactic issue, right? So related to what we did last week and the week before. This time we're looking at multiple sentences. Basically, it's sentences that contain more than one clause. Now, there is a lot of overlap with what we've done over the past year, and the book does recommend that you sometimes go back and reread sections. I do recommend that you take up their recommendation, especially if there are particular areas that you think are not quite clear. So the book operates with a set of terms to classify different types of sentences in terms of the clauses they contain, and they also have two sets of terms that classify types of clauses. So let's just look at types of sentences here first. So this first set of terms basically divides sentences into categories based on their inner complexity. So we can see here that the first one is a simple sentence, and it's basically a sentence consisting of just one clause. And we have an example of that. We then also have multiple sentences, and basically these are sentences consisting of two or more clauses, and we have two different types. The first type is a compound sentence, which is then a sentence that contains a coordinator. So in this case, we have the use of the word and, which is a coordinated conjunction, and we can see on either side we have a main clause. Right? So here we have a compound sentence. We can also have complex sentences, and these contain clauses embedded inside other clauses. And we can see here I've used these square brackets to indicate how these different clauses are embedded inside. So we have this one, right, to see him. That's a clause which is embedded in this bigger one, who was not able to see him, right? Who is embedded inside this bigger one, to kill Han Solo. All right, we have the relative clause there, who was not able, and then to see him, right? So you can see here we have lots. You can see all these four different brackets down here at the end. So lots of clauses inside, yeah? But obviously, we can also have both coordination and subordination inside one sentence. So here we get what the book calls a mixed type, which is possibly not the best term. So here we have examples of both coordination, right, with and. So that's a compound there. But we can also see here that we have clauses inside, yeah, inside one another. So this is an example of this mixed type. Now, the next set of terms basically has to do with the structure and form of clauses. So here we're basically looking at the structure, right? So the structural categories of clauses. So once we've looked at the sentence as a whole to see, is it simple, is it complex, we then need to be able to identify the type of clause that we have inside the sentence. So the first type is a finite clause. So this is a clause, right, where the verb reflects person, number, and tense. So we can say it's specified, all right, in terms of tense. So this operator, okay, which is also the verb, is present, and usually we'll also find a subject there. So here in the example we have this clause there, which was not so good, and we can see that that's finite because we have was. All right. This one here as well, actually, that's also a finite clause because we can see that this verb is inflected for person, number, and tense. We also have something called reduced clauses. So these are basically where something is missing. One of the types is a non-finite clause. So here, the non-finite clause, basically the verb does not reflect person, number, and tense, and it may or may not contain a subject. So here again we have the second clause there, to cry like a baby. So we can see we have a verb there, cry, but it's also in the infinitive, right? Because it's to cry. Yeah, so this is not inflected for person, number, and tense. There's also no subject there. We don't know who's doing the crying. Obviously, if we go out into the bigger one, if we go out into the clause next to it, the main clause, we can see it's he. He was just about. So we can infer that it's also he that is the subject of to cry. But in this case, there is no overt subject. We also have verbless clauses. They're also a type of reduced clause. And basically here the verb is missing altogether. Yeah, so again, they may or may not contain a subject. So if we say John cried like a baby, and then we have and here, so we can see that we have the coordinator there. Jill like a monkey. We know that it's Jill cried like a monkey, right? We know that that's meant to be there in the middle, but it's been dropped. We can see here that Jill is obviously the subject, so this sentence has a subject. So another type of typology of clauses is based on their function, right? So basically here we're looking at the functional categories of clauses. So maybe we've identified a clause, maybe we've identified that it's non-finite, all right? But then we have to figure out, what does it do in the sentence, right? What's its function? So just like when you're doing your sentence analysis and you have to find form and function, right? We have to think about the clauses in the same way. So the first function of a clause is a nominal function. So clauses that have nominal functions are called nominal clauses. So basically a nominal clause means that the clause takes up a syntactic function typically realized by a noun phrase. Okay, so hence the link with nominals. Nominal also means noun, right? So think about all the places in a sentence where you can find a noun phrase. You'll find them in the subject position, object position, complements, prepositional complements. So basically, nominal clauses can occur in the same place and they will have a syntactic function. All right, so again, just looking at this first one, we can see here, getting killed by Nazis. That's a clause. Yeah, getting killed by Nazis, because we have both get and killed actually, so we have the verbs there. And we can see here that that functions as a subject. Okay, so getting killed by Nazis is not my idea of fun. Yeah, and I've just indicated here that it's a subject. The second one, you tell me that you made this yourself. So that you made this yourself, right? Here we have this finite clause, and we can see it functions as the direct object. Yeah, and so on. So we can see we can have them in the position of the indirect object, subject complement, object complement, a real subject, right, and a real object. So we can see here we have this preliminary subject, it's stupid to think that one can kill blah blah blah, or a real object. Okay, I consider it stupid. Here we have the preliminary object, right, and then we have the real object following. Yeah, a different kind of function is the adverbial. So an adverbial clause basically takes up the syntactic function of an adverbial, right? So where you would normally find an adverbial, you may find a clause, and that makes it an adverbial clause. Yeah. And again, we have some examples of that. You can sleep when you're old. We can also say you can sleep later, right? And later, that's an adverbial. But we can see we can also have a finite clause in this case, in the same position. We also have modifying clauses. So modifying clauses modify a noun, an adjective, or an adverb. So that's hence the name, right? They modify them. So you'll often find these in post-modifying positions. So if you just look at A here, my sword will send you to the man who lives upstairs. So here we can see who lives upstairs. That's a clause. Yeah, it's a finite clause. The subject is who, and that co-index is man, but the man is a noun phrase. Okay, and this relative clause, right, the modifying clause here actually occurs in the post-modifier position. Yeah, so modifying clauses, they tend to modify nouns, adjectives, or adverbs. Let's look at compound sentences. So remember, compound sentences are these sentences that contain a coordinator. So normally and, for instance, a coordinating conjunction, right? So compound sentences then contain clauses, right, which are then coordinated, and we call this synthetically. If they are coordinated synthetically, it means that they occur with a coordinating conjunction in between. Okay, so like in A here. We can actually also find compound sentences which are coordinated asynthetically. So that means that the coordinating conjunction has been left out. It's not there. And we see an example of this in B. Finally, we can obviously mix. We can mix and match. So in C, the first two clauses, okay, we have asynthetic coordination, and then the final one, the third, we have and. So that's synthetic coordination. So because we have and, we say that the whole thing is synthetic coordination. We also need to talk about ellipses in compound sentences. So ellipsis means to leave something out. So normally when we talk about compound sentences, we say that the clauses, all right, inside a compound sentence, okay, so for instance, on either side of the and, they can occur independently. So if you go back to the top here, Jack was there, you can have that on its own. Jill was there, that also functions on its own. But if you have ellipsis of the subject or the verb, all right, in the non-first clauses, so the second one or the ones later, then the question is whether that's really possible that they can then occur on their own. So we can see that here at the bottom with A and B. So we can say they ate food and drank wine. So the here, right, the empty category indicates that we have left something out, we've cut it out. So obviously it should be they drank wine, yeah? But we can say they ate food and drank wine, but we can't say drank wine on its own, right? That's not a clause. And again here we have left out the uses, right? We've left out the verb, but obviously you can't say I and X. So when we have ellipses, it does sort of change that, okay? So no longer can we say that the two clauses can occur independently. Now, as the term coordination indicates, coordinated sentences in a compound sentence are at the same structural level. So that means that they're not subordinate to each other, and this is called parataxis. So parataxis is the main structural function of coordinating conjunction. But in addition to that, these coordinating conjunctions, they also express semantic relationships between the coordinated clauses. For instance, if you have and, this expresses addition, obviously, but expresses contrast, and or expresses an alternative. So here we have a couple of examples, right? So here we have examples of I want Coca-Cola and I want Pepsi, so I basically want both. I don't want Coca-Cola, but I want Pepsi. So here we can see the contrast. And do you want Coca-Cola or do you want Pepsi? So here we can see that there are two alternatives. Now you should note that in some cases, coordinated clauses follow a type of underlying logical order. So for instance, a chronology of events, and this determines the linear order of the syntactic coordination. So we can see here in A that this sentence makes perfect sense. He got into his car, started the car, and drove out of town. But if you rearrange the different clauses inside this coordinated sentence, okay, so that they violate the chronology, okay, so there's a lot of logic that lies underneath. If you say he drove out of town, ignited his car, got into the car, you think, hang on, right, something's not quite right. So this is also an example of what we call iconicity. So this is when the form of a sign imitates the content. So in that the underlying chronology of events is reflected in the syntactic coordination of clauses. So basically the order, right, of the individual clauses. Now, complex sentences, right, they contain clauses that are embedded in the main clause. So what is left if you remove all of the subordinate clauses or the subclauses, right? That's the main clause. So in complex sentences then, these subclauses are then subordinate to the main clause. So we call this hypotaxis. Okay, so just compare that with the parataxis, where the different clauses are on the same level. So quite often subclauses are linked in a different way, right, in different ways to the main clause, and we use linking devices to show that link. So linking devices are grammatical forms, right, words, which appear at the beginning of a clause, and they link the subclause to the main clause. Now, English has a number of different types of linking devices, and we're going to look at them. So first we have subordinating conjunctions. So as, if, when, that's, because, as though, right? Now, some of them you might recognize because we've talked about them when we talked about prepositional phrases. So some of them may indeed be both subordinating conjunctions and prepositions. So their main syntactic function is hypotaxis, but they also express a semantic relationship. For instance, as, because, inasmuch as, right, they express a type of reason or cause, whereas if expresses, for instance, a condition. After obviously expresses that something comes later on, right, posteriority. And while expresses that something takes place at the same time, so simultaneity in time. So some of these conjunctions are, of course, polysemous. That means they can have more than one meaning and they may express more than one type of relationship. Now, relatives are also linking devices. So these relative pronouns, who, which, and that. So these are not subordinating conjunctions, okay, because obviously they are basically relative pronouns, and relative clauses then take up syntactic function, and it means that the relative pronoun that introduces them also take up a syntactic function. So when you're conducting your sentence analysis, you should be assigning a syntactic function, so maybe subject, for instance, to these relative pronouns. You don't do that to a subordinating conjunction, right? They don't have a syntactic function. We also have interrogatives that we can use to link these subclauses. So which, how, who, why, and these also take up syntactic functions rather than being subordinating conjunctions. So looking at non-finite clauses again. So there are basically three different types of non-finite clauses, and these are based on the three major non-finite clause forms. So the first here is the present participial clause. So basically, this is where we have the presence of a present participle. So that's the ing ending, right, on the verb. And we can have that with an explicit or an implied subject. So here we just have it with an explicit subject, and we see the clause here, arriving. Jack and Jill arriving late last night. All right, and then Jill making strange monkey noises. So here we can see we have Jack and Jill, right? So that's an explicit subject, and we can see it's this present participial clause because it's non-finite, right? And it's present participial because we have the verb ending in ing. An example of one with an implied subject. Here we have puking like a sick man. So we don't know, right, who it is. We don't have a subject right before the verb in this case. So again, we can sort of figure out what it is, but it's only implied, the fact that it's also he, right? But again, here we can see the ing ending, also over here on having. That's also the ing ending. So these are present participial clauses. We also have the past participial clauses. So this is where basically the verb obviously is the past participle, so ending in ed. And again, we can have that both with an explicit subject and also with an implied subject. Now here, for instance, shot in this case, okay, so just note that this is an irregular verb, so it doesn't actually end in ed. Had it been a regular verb, it would have ended in ed, right? But again, because it's an irregular verb, the past participle looks different. Yeah. We also have the third and final one is the infinitive clause, right? And again, we can have that both with explicit and implied subject. So here the verb is the infinitive. And here we have some examples. We have to move it. Yeah, so to move, that's in the infinitive, right? And this is an implied subject because there is no subject right before, right? Whereas if we compare it down here to be, they want me to do something. So to do, again, that's the infinitive. Yeah. And then we have me here. So that's the explicit subject. Now, remember that we also have something called the bare infinitive. So we can sometimes have the infinitive occurring without the infinitive marker too. So we have that here. All I want to do is have some fun, right? So have here is also in the infinitive, but it's a bare infinitive. Yeah, and the implied subjects, okay, because we don't have a subject right before the verb there. And then this one, I thought I heard you cry. This is also the bare infinitive, but with the explicit subject. Let's look at nominal clauses. So nominal clauses, remember, they function like noun phrases. So they can occupy the same positions, all right, at the primary level, so subject, direct, object, and so on. And at non-primary level, they can occur as post modifiers and as prepositional complements. So there are different clause types which can have a nominal function. We can have a that clause. Now, they usually start with that, but you can actually leave that out. So here we have a that clause, right, functioning as a subject. That child married Camilla came as a shock to all. Okay, and here we also have one as a post modifier. Elizabeth did not like the suggestion that Charles should marry Camilla. We also have interrogative clauses. They can also be nominal clauses. So here we can see it functions as the direct object. Kate wondered if Harry is a bad influence on William. We also have something called nominal relative clauses. So William was upset about what Kate had thought. Right, here we can see that this nominal relative clause occupies the prepositional complement position. So about here is the head of the prepositional phrase. ING clauses can also occur as nominal clauses. We can say causing trouble was Harry's favorite pastime, where causing trouble is the subject. ED clauses. We see here that the beer served now functions as the direct objects. And finally, we have infinitive clauses. So here we have our verbs in the infinitive, right? So Kate saw William and Harry stagger about the tennis court, absolutely hammered. And we can see this whole clause here functions as the direct object. Now, I should really add a few extra comments when it comes to these nominal clauses as prepositional complements, because they can be quite problematic for Danes. So nominal clauses which can function as prepositional complements are interrogative clauses, nominal relative clauses, and ing clauses. So in English, that clauses and infinitive clauses cannot occur following a prepositional head. So they can in Danish, all right, but they cannot do that in English. So obviously we have some solutions to solve that problem. You can just leave out the preposition, okay? If the preposition is vague in meaning, that's probably okay. So you could just say, I'm sure that. You don't have to say, I'm sure of that. You can obviously, I'm sure of something, but you cannot have this of, which is a preposition followed by that. So you can leave it out. You can try and use an ing clause instead. So instead of saying han gik uden at sige, right, he left without to say, that doesn't work, but you could say he left without saying. We can use this construction with fact, all right, so apart from the fact that, or similar, a similar thing, a suggestion or idea or some other noun, All right, that can solve that problem. Or we can simply just avoid this prepositional construction and completely go with a different type of verb. So you can always say talking about, right? But you can't say she talked about that. Because again, about there is a preposition followed by that, which doesn't work. You can then just change the verb. Instead of talking about, you can maybe choose mentioned. All right, and then you will have bypassed that problem. Now, nominal clauses can occur as both subjects and direct objects, right, as we've just seen. And we learned last week that sometimes we move constituents to the end of a sentence if they're very heavy. So this was the end weight principle. And this means that we sometimes need a placeholder for these very long and heavy subjects or direct objects in their appropriate place in the constituent order when we've moved them to the end. Right? Sometimes we need something to sort of indicate that there was a space, right, for this subject or direct object. So we obviously use the preliminary subjects or objects for this. So if we look at the first one, that Harry is a little rascal, surprised no one. That is the long subject, right, that we have, which is the clause, right? Now, because this is quite big, maybe we think, it doesn't sound very good, it's difficult to understand, it's poor form to start a sentence with that, so we basically want a construction with it instead, right, with this preliminary subject. So we can say that it surprised no one, that Harry is a little rascal. Or, in the case of the direct objects, we have it here again as the placeholder. I find it hard to believe. And then the real direct object, which is that no one thinks Harry is a little rascal. Now, some verbs even require it as a preliminary subject, right? So our verbs like appears and seems. It appears, it seems, right? Here we actually need it as the subject. Now, there can, of course, also be used as a preliminary subject, and this is used in what we call existential sentences. So its use is determined by the end focus principle, which is that new information goes to the end. So if we say there were 1,000 guests at the royal wedding, then there, I mean, it's the guests that are at the wedding, right? But obviously we actually have there here, which is then this preliminary subject, and then 1,000 guests is the real subject in this case. And we can see here that we also have agreement, right? So concord between the verb were and then the real subject, which is 1,000 guests, so plural in this case. Now, you should note that this construction is quite frequent in Danish, and it's often even used in a passive construction, but that this is not possible in English. And often it is used in formal writing, which means we see a lot of it in projects and stuff from students, but it's actually not possible. So in Danish, it's perfectly fine to say, der blev lavet ændringer i programmet here, right? That's absolutely fine. That's a passive with der blev lavet. But we can't actually say there were made some changes to the program. That's not possible. That's a passive construction there with there as a preliminary subject. All right, and that's basically not possible. That's why we have the asterisk there. Basically, what you need to do is have changes. Changes were made to the program. So that's absolutely fine to say that, yeah, where we have the real subject, okay, rather than a preliminary one. So that's absolutely fine in English, but we cannot have there as a preliminary subject in passive constructions. Now, adverbial clauses, basically they function as adverbials, right? Hence the name. So again, this is their function. We need to see what kind of clauses can fulfill this function. We can have finite clauses, right? So they will often start with a conjunction. And again, you can look in the book because there's a long list of the types of conjunctions that can occur in this place. We can also have both non-finite and verbalist clauses functioning as adverbials in a sentence, okay? So they may start with some sort of conjunction, but they are usually without one, right? They usually occur without a conjunction. But we can also classify adverbial clauses based on their meaning, Okay, we can classify adverbial clauses as adverbials of time, adverbials of manner, adverbials of place, and again, check your book to see the very extensive list of examples of this. Right, so adverbial clauses still, non-finite adverbial clauses then, they may actually be ambiguous in their meaning. And this can make them quite difficult to understand and also translate if that's what you're doing. And that's because they don't have this conjunction at the beginning, right? It's optional. Because conjunctions, as we saw, that basically describes the relationship between different clauses, between the sentence and the clause, right? Between the main clause and the subclause. So without one of those, we have to guess how they're related, right? How can we interpret this non-finite adverbial clause? Maybe it denotes time, maybe it denotes manner, and so on. Now, finally, we also need to talk about modifying clauses. So this is again, the final type of clauses here. And modifying clauses, they function as post-modifiers. They can occur in noun phrases, where they can be relative clauses. Okay, and relative clauses may then be finite. It was Kate who stole the show. Yeah, so stole here is linked to who. They can be non-finite, we call that a reduced relative, and also verbless. Yeah, also a reduced relative. So again, basically here, mischief is enough to hang out with celebrities. We don't have a verb at all. Modifying clauses, all right, can also function as post-modifiers in appositive clauses. So appositions, all right, appositive clauses can also be finite and non-finite. So here we have an example of Charles ignored Liz's comments. That's Camilla is too boring for words. And non-finite, William kept his promise to behave himself when drinking with Harry. So again, we can see to behave, that's definitely infinitive there. We can also find them in adjective phrases. And here they can either be finite or non-finite. So here we have glamorous, right? That's the adjective phrase. And we can see we have this modifying clause as a post-modifier inside, right? As glamorous as it's cracked up to be. And finally, we can find these modifying clauses as post-modifiers in adverbial clauses, adverbial phrases, where they can again either be finite or non-finite. So here, Harry drank so much, right? So that's an adverbial phrase. And then that William couldn't keep up. That is a post-modifier, right? So it modifies the degree of how much in a way. Yeah? Now, this final slide, you can also find this as a PDF on the Moodle page, and it basically just shows the sentence tree, if you will, so a full type of analysis. And if we just start at the top, I know there's quite a lot to take in. We can see we have a sentence which consists of a main clause and may have some subclauses as well on either side. But this just provides an overview, and it may help you when you're doing your different types of analysis and other tasks, for instance, on the exam. So we can see that we have the different functions, first of all, in the main clause. So in a main clause and subclauses for that matter, we will need a subject, a verb, possibly a subject complement, or maybe a direct object, and so on, right? So these are all the different functions that can occur. And then we can see, well, what can occur, right, as the subject? What's the material? So we call it material, here we call it form, right? But normally we say the material. So what kind of things can occur as the subject? Well, noun phrases, obviously, they are definitely the most common. And then we can see inside the noun phrase, if we go down into that phrase analysis, we will have a determiner, possibly a pre-modifier, then the head, and then a post-modifier. And then we can see, well, what kinds of things can occur as post-modifiers in a noun phrase? Well, relative clauses, appositive clauses, and then prepositional phrases. And again, if we have a relative clause as a post-modifier in a noun phrase, we have two different types. They can either be restrictive or non-restrictive, and remember this is linked to the use of commas. Both of them can be reduced or non-reduced, right? If they're reduced, they can either be a clause in the infinitive or a clause with the ing participle, right? So that's how you read it. So there's quite a lot, but you basically just follow these sort of arrows, right? We have the subject complement here. A subject complement can be a noun phrase, it can be a nominal clause, or it can be an adjective phrase. And again, if it's an adjective phrase, you can see what that can consist of. We can see it can have a post modifier. We can see that a modifying clause can occur in this post modifier position, like we just said. Okay, and we then have again different types of modifier clauses, again finite, non-finite, and if they're non-finite, they can either be a clause in the infinitive or a clause with the ing participle. So there's quite a lot to take in, all right, but just sit and maybe have a look at the PDF or pause the video and try and follow these different arrows so you can basically just get sort of an overview of which things can occur in which positions, right? Which material can fulfill which functions.